Welcome back to another Reddit readings video. If you enjoy these stories, don't be scared to leave a like. Now, do be scared. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. My wife thinks I should win a Nobel. My wife, Nadia, hates me, so it's really saying something. She says I astonish her. That's quite the compliment. But I vastly prefer the arguments of just a month ago when she'd yell at me about how cold I've become, and I'd rifle back by calling her a bitch. This is a brief story, but I suppose I should back up. I filed for divorce on July 4th, 2022, Independence Day. It wasn't a long time coming. I thought I'd stay with that woman till death did us part. We had only been fighting regularly for the last 5 years. My wife, my love, Nadia, the neurotic neurologist with a face of deep wrinkles forged from stress and cigarettes. Just 40 years old last year, but unfortunately for her 40 is not the new 30. Brain surgeons aren't looking any younger. The truth will come out anyway if I'm telling an accurate account of this horror, so I might as well get ahead of it. I'm vain. Perhaps a better word is shallow. Beauty to me has always been skin deep, and the moral of the ugly duckling was that he wasn't ugly forever. Thank God. Nadia was fucking gorgeous. But please note the tense. Around her 35th birthday, I began to blanch when I woke up next to her in the morning. How can just 10 years eclipse a face so pretty? I know Nadia went harder on herself than most. 18-hour surgeries concluding with no heartbeat. All that work just to be berated by the family. Couldn't you have done more? I get it. I'm sympathetic to her stress. She's by far and away the breadwinner. But that doesn't mean I was ready to be married to someone who looked so old so soon. I did not love her, but I just knew I could do so much better. And with so much life left to live, I'm only 36 years old. I was still a handsome young man with the world at my fingertips. I could easily date a girl who's 30 and get another 10-year head start on father time. Besides, I thought, Nadia will be fine. She's brilliant and ambitious. We don't have any kids to worry about. A divorce was far from the end of the world. It happens. I can see what you think. I know it's pathetic to only be wed till wrinkles do us part. But it was done. She was served on that 4th of July, after our friends went home, sulfur smoke still hanging under the streetlights. She asked why, and I should have lied, but I told her how her beauty had run off, leaving me waking next to a face I didn't care to recognize. She didn't even look at me. She just stared at the grass and cried. It was hard on me, too. I felt awful, truly, but we were adults. We didn't yell or scream. This would end amicably. Okay, it wasn't that simple. I wanted some of her money, but just enough to live on. I wasn't going to bleed her dry. She had plenty of the stuff and hardly ever spent it. The next week I was living in the basement while the lawyers worked it all out. Nadia had been too furious to even speak with me. When I told her that I wasn't going to rent a place yet but move downstairs instead, she didn't nod or acknowledge me. She just walked away. One night when I was watching TV, she had snuck up behind me. It wasn't intentional. Our home was one of those suburban monstrosities with thick carpets that swallowed sound. Richard, I jumped and spilled my chips and salsa all down my shirt. Nadia, what the fuck? I said with my mouth full. I'm watching Knight Rider. We should talk. She held up a 5th of whiskey and wiggled it. About us. My eyes bulged like a child's when I saw the bottle. It was a fucking Yamazaki 1999. A $2,000 bottle of whiskey that Nadia had once chastised me for buying myself. Sure, babe. I'm not your babe. Right. I didn't care. I was salivating already. Eyes on that beautiful amber bottle. After just one glass, things got hazy. But I wasn't worried. Nadia wasn't the poisoning type. She was far smarter than that. But before we'd even dented the bottle, the world went black. I woke in some kind of coma. I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't hear anything. But there wasn't even my relentless tinnitus ring, accumulated from a youth of corn concerts. There was nothing for every sense. No smell, no sight, no taste. I couldn't even feel my tongue. Is this the purgatory that coma patients feel? I began to panic, but was even more disturbed when I couldn't feel my heartbeat. There was no surge of adrenaline in my gut. I couldn't scream. I pictured myself strapped to a bed in the guest room, Nadia smiling over me as she propped my head under a pillow, getting the last laugh after all. But this was wrong. Nadia's worst nightmare would be taking care of an incontinent Richard. My worry faded as I could suddenly see. Pinpoints of light appeared in the distance. It looked like the night sky, but the darkness and the space between the stars was absolute, a galactic black. The little lights grew, and the dark was erased. The pinpoints, I realized, were pixels. I was looking at a gigantic screen. A cursor blinked in a text box. Hello, Richard. It's your ancient-looking wife. If you can hear me, look down. I looked down and realized then that I couldn't blink. I couldn't close my eyes. I began looking around the screen frantically when more words flashed across the screen. I'm sorry, you can't close them. But don't worry, I've got you on a cycle of eye drops. You should know I was an inch away from taking your eyes, but I have something you need to see. I desperately wanted to hear my heart thump in my chest, to not just think fear, but to feel it in my body, but I was paralyzed. The signals I sent to my arms and legs went unanswered. A video player appeared on the screen. She clicked the pizza slice of a play button. It was our wedding video, bits of it playing in a montage. There I was, handsome in a brown suit, and Nadia was beautiful, her cheeks youthful, burning with blush. We kissed, fed each other cake. My eyes got wetter and the video stopped. There's one more I want to show you now. It's a time lapse. She typed, 1 photo every 4 hours under 24-hour light. She pulled up a new tab, hit play. Oh God, I tried to scream, but I was more than speechless. In the video, outside under a floodlight, my severed head sat on a mound of mud. I couldn't believe what I saw. It was me, my head, but I was clearly dead. Where my eyes should have been in my head were twin black holes, and my dead mouth sagged in a sad clown smile. The frame switched, another 4 hours passed, and my skin peeled a little from my skull. It was too high quality to be some kind of deep fake. It was too real. The frames continued to flash. Bugs and worms crawled out of the earth and into my eye sockets. My cheeks began to bloat and then blacken with swarms of flies. A few seconds later, the flesh burst to reveal balls of maggots swarming beneath the skin. My skin, but it can't be. I'm watching a video. I can see the fucking buffer bar. There are no video players in hell, right? The decomposition continued. The maggots hatched into flies that abandoned my head as most of the skin on the skull had rotted away, and the time lapse stopped. The video played normally, and Nadia's feet appeared on camera. She squatted so she was in frame. She smiled. She waved. She snapped on a pair of purple latex gloves, then picked up my head and took off the top of my skull as if it were some kind of Halloween decoration. This can't be. This can't be. She tilted the skull towards the camera. My head was hollow, my skull brainless. Nadia smiled and the video vanished. The cursor was back, blinking for several seconds on the screen before words began to appear. Isn't that funny? You thought I was getting old. Look at you, Richard. Time has already taken you back to the earth. I wasn't dead, I realized, but I couldn't understand how I was experiencing reality after watching the video. Did she clone me? Make some kind of model of my head? The typing continued. I haven't enabled it yet, but you will be able to type using your eyes, kinda like Stephen Hawking. She stopped for a moment. That was a stupid thing to write. Please know you are nothing like Stephen Hawking. Second thing is you'll have access to the internet. You're very special now, Richard. I'd like to keep you entertained. I'd like to keep you alive. But as incredible as you are, your appearance is disgusting. It's pathetic. You look like something beached waiting to be picked apart by gulls. I knew then what she'd done to me, and I wish I could say my heart stopped. I'll paint you a picture. Your brain sits in a 50-gallon tank with your spinal cord fishboning out behind you. Your eyes are set above the fluid, still connected to your brain, but they're inside tubes that look out only to the screen you see now. Without eyelids, they have a constant look of cartoonish surprise. They make me laugh. Your heart is artificial. It's a metal box that pumps oxygenated blood through your brain at 60 beats per minute. I can reach out and pat it. The typing paused. Just like that. I've always wondered if this procedure was possible. It turns out you are an astonishment, a work of scientific genius you never had a chance of being with a body. You cost every dollar I ever saved. And you, I think you could win the Nobel Prize in Physiology. Even without a face, I can still see you in there, Richard. And I really do think you're still beautiful like this. I would have loved you as you grew wrinkly and old. I loved you, naively, for who you were. Why couldn't you have thought the same of me? The typing stopped. She wanted me to think about that, and I have been for some time now, because she hasn't typed anything since. It's been 24 days now and I roam the internet with my eyes. Every day is an existential crisis. Every day I try to find an identity. Take away our faces, our skin and our scars, and we're all the same plain, gray matter. I was never a handsome young man with the world at my fingertips. I lived inside one. I'm a lonely mind in a black vat of liquid. How horrifying to realize that this is what I always was. That even when I had a body and a face to admire in the mirror, I was just as I am now. Nothing but a brain in a box. My wife has 2 faces and I'm terrified of them. My wife Quinn used to be a nice person. She was kind, considerate, understanding, and helpful. She had all the attributes that you would want in a friend. She once spotted a person begging for food on our way out of the grocery store and walked back in to buy them one of those pre-packaged lunches as well as a drink and a dessert. I was always in awe of my wife's acts of kindness and incredibly grateful that I had found her. She always made sure to do the laundry every week, which included ironing all of my work clothes and folding or hanging everything up so it would be good to go for the upcoming work week. She would remind me about big events that didn't even concern her, like my mother's birthday or my niece's school dance recital. If it wasn't for her, I'd be fucked when it comes to most areas of my life. But that's just how we balance each other out. I'm a dunce. She pays attention to details and makes sure that I don't miss important dates. I don't know what caused the sudden change in her attitude. I've tried to pinpoint it down to one specific event, one specific day, but so far I haven't had much luck. I do have a very vivid memory of when I first noticed the biggest change. However, I had gotten a call at work. It was from my mother, and she wanted to know if my wife and I would be bringing anything to the family dinner that weekend. I, of course, was confused as I had no memory of a family dinner being discussed. Upon hearing this, my mother became annoyed, saying we had discussed this just 2 weeks ago when we got together for my cousin Jolene's birthday. I was also getting annoyed at this point, firstly because my mother was calling me at work while I was busy, but also because my wife, who was always on top of stuff like this, had somehow forgotten to give me a heads up. Look, Mom, I can't really talk right now. I'll discuss this with Quinn when I get home and I'll call you when we figure something out, I replied as I turned back to the pile of documents I was trying to get through. Fine, Tony, whatever. Just make sure you let me know by the end of the day so I can go buy whatever we might be missing. I hung up the phone as I tried to ignore my frustration, unable to completely brush it off. However, I picked up my phone again and sent Quinn a text. My mom called. She wants to know what we're bringing to dinner. Didn't even know a dinner was happening. Thanks for filling me in, I guess. In hindsight, the message was probably unnecessary, and albeit a little passive-aggressive, but at the time all that I could focus on was the fact that my normally responsible wife had caused me to get scolded by my mother while at work. That evening when I got home, the house was quiet. Normally, at this hour, Quinn would be finishing up dinner, but I walked into the kitchen to find 2 pots on the stove while my wife was nowhere in sight. I approached the stove and lifted the lid on the pots. The first one had some boxed mac and cheese that had cooled down enough for it to get all dry and clumpy. The second one had steamed broccoli. I set my phone and my keys down on the kitchen table and made my way upstairs to look for my wife. I found her in our bed, laying with her back to me with the blanket pulled up over her head. "Quinn?" I asked. She didn't reply. I took my shoes off and approached the bed, reaching out to shake her. "Quinn, are you asleep?" I asked. She sighed. "Not anymore." I walked around the bed towards the bathroom, getting out of my work clothes and stepping over the clothing as it fell on the floor around my feet. "Did you get my text?" I asked. She still hadn't moved, but I could see her face now and she was staring off into space. "Quinn, did you see my text?" I repeated. Her eyes flickered over to me for a second before she looked away again. "Yeah, I got the text," she replied, annoyed. "Okay, well, we need to figure out what we're gonna do and call my mom back." Quinn sat up as I began walking into the bathroom. "We, or me?" she asked. "What?" I called as I turned the shower on. She said nothing in return, so I stepped into the shower, thinking that maybe I had misheard her. When I got out of the shower, she was no longer in bed. I dried off and walked towards the dresser to look for some clothes to change into, tripping over my work pants on the way. I huffed, annoyed as I kicked them out of the way, towards the laundry hamper. Once I had changed, I made my way back downstairs and into the kitchen. I spotted Quinn sitting on the living room couch, looking down at her phone. I opened the fridge, scanning the contents for a few seconds before closing it and walking into the living room. "Hey babe, do we have anything to eat?" I asked. "Yeah, there's mac and cheese on the stove, and some vegetables," she replied, not once looking up from her phone. "Boxed mac and cheese isn't really a meal," I pointed out. "Okay, so eat the veggies then." I stared at her, but she didn't even seem to notice. "Babe, you know I'm not a huge fan of broccoli," I replied. Quinn finally looked up, glaring at me. "So starved for all I care," she snapped. She got up and marched back upstairs after that, slamming the door to her office shut as I stood there speechless. I didn't know what to do or say as her reaction had caught me completely off guard. I ended up eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that night and sleeping in our bed by myself. The following morning, Quinn stayed in her office as I got ready for work, running around trying to pack up all of my stuff and get dressed and make coffee and get some breakfast. When I finally made it out the door, I was pissed. I didn't know what had gotten into her recently, and for the rest of the day, I walked around frustrated, annoyed, and tired. To make matters worse, my mother texted me during my lunch break to follow up about the dinner. I ignored her message and turned my phone off for the remainder of my shift. Over the next few days, I would see Quinn sitting around the house. Every day when I got home was the same. However, I would come back to either no dinner or random leftovers of whatever she had eaten. She would ignore me most of the time, only talking to me when I asked her a question directly. Most of the time, I would find her looking at her phone or locked away in her office doing God knows what. One Saturday morning, I saw her doing yoga in her office with the door open. I stood in the doorway as she followed along to a video she had pulled up on her laptop. She turned to face me as she bent over in a stretch and closed her eyes when she saw me. "Did you make any coffee?" I asked, breaking the silence. She kept her eyes closed as she changed positions, stretching to the other side. "I don't even drink coffee, Tony." I watched her for a few seconds as she stood up and lifted one of her legs, leaning forward and opening her arms. "What are you talking about?" I asked. Her head turned towards me quickly. "I don't fucking like coffee." I said nothing as she continued on with her routine, watching her for a few moments. "You know," I finally said, "you really need to calm the fuck down. Maybe the yoga was a good idea." I turned and walked out of the room after that, not bothering to hear her response. Not that she would have given me one anyway. We didn't speak for the rest of that day, and we also never made it to the family dinner. I, of course, received calls from family members wondering where we were. Feeling petty, I decided to tell them that it was Quinn's fault, that she was the one who didn't want to see them. I realized my mistake very quickly when she threw open her office door and marched downstairs and stood in front of the television as I was in the middle of a movie. "Can you move?" I asked. "Did you tell your fucking parents that I didn't want to see them?" she demanded. I sighed as I watched the screen around her body. "You've got to be fucking kidding me," she laughed flatly. "Well, it's the truth, isn't it? You didn't mention it. You wouldn't talk about it. So what was I supposed to do?" She crossed her arms over her chest. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe think of something yourself for once instead of relying on me or your mom to do everything for you." I rolled my eyes. "You know, you've been acting like a bitch lately and I don't appreciate it." This, I motioned towards her vaguely, is not the person I married. Quinn stood there for a second, nodding at me before she turned around and left again. The next morning, it all went to shit. When I woke up, Quinn was in the kitchen, walking around stirring and flipping things in pans on the stove. I thought we were back to normal for a second and walked in, ready to eat. "Good morning, babe," I said, approaching the kitchen counter. At the sound of my voice, Quinn turned around to face me and my breath caught in my throat as I looked at her. Her face had changed. She still had her face, except it was different, weird, terrifying. One half of her face was done up with makeup. It was cheery. That side of her mouth was turned up in a smile, and her eye looked kind as she looked at me. The other side of her face, however, was contorted into a sneer. It was not a facial expression that a regular human would make. Instead, her eyebrow was furrowed aggressively and her eye was wide and twitching in anger and dark red as if she hadn't slept in hours. Her nose was even wrinkled and turned up and that half of her upper lip was lifted, exposing her teeth slightly. She looked furious, angrier than I had ever seen anyone look. She looked like a monster. "What's wrong, babe? Don't you want some quiche?" The happy side of her face asked me. When it spoke, the left side of her mouth did not move, and yet her speech wasn't hindered in any way. I didn't reply. I couldn't reply. I was still in shock. I wasn't sure whether I should scream or cry. "Are you gonna fucking answer or what?" The other side of her face snapped. "And no thank you," I stuttered. "I don't want any." "Oh," the happy side said, disappointed. "Well, I can make you something else if you want. Do you want pancakes?" The other side laughed. "You're such a fucking loser." I stepped away from the counter and backed out of the room. "Let me know if you want anything else," she called after me. I hurried back up into our bedroom and shut the door, leaning against it. I don't know how long I stayed up there, but eventually, I was too hungry to continue hiding out and ended up walking back into the kitchen. Quinn was still in there, sitting at the table. Both halves of her face looked at me when I came in. "There's some quiche still, and I also make pancakes for you in case you wanted those instead," she said. The other side of her face rolled its eye. I walked over and grabbed some pancakes, not really trusting that she hadn't poisoned them. I ate in silence as I sat across the table from her. "Tony, why won't you look at me?" the nice side asked. I glanced up at her. "I am looking at you. You've been avoiding me all morning," she said. "I'm just tired." I could feel her gaze on me as I kept eating and tried to ignore it. Once I was done, I put my plate in the sink and quickly walked out of the kitchen again and into the living room where I sat on the couch to watch some TV. I thought about what I should do at that moment. How was I supposed to fix her? Could this even be fixed? She was the one who always had the answers to our problems. I heard the faucet running and the sound of drawers being opened and closed as she put away the leftovers. I wasn't even sure if she had eaten yet. After a while, she walked into the living room and sat down right next to me. I kept my vision forward, trying to avoid her. Tony, she sang. I remained laser focused on the TV. She reached her hand up and turned my face to look at her. I felt nauseated as I looked at her face, or faces. It was even worse up close. It looked fake, like she had on some weird mask. The good side of her smiled at me and suddenly she was leaning in. I was unable to move back quickly enough and soon her lips were pressed against mine. I stayed still until I felt her teeth bite down on my lip. Ouch, I mumbled. She bit harder. Oh, I yelled, pulling back. She kept biting, moving her teeth back and forth like she was trying to saw through my lip. I shouted as I pushed her back, but she was freakishly strong for some reason. I wasn't able to pull her away until she had bitten off a piece of my lip. I stood up off the couch as blood ran down my chin, watching the evil side of her face chew my lip a few times before spitting it out at my feet. What the fuck? I shouted. The good side of her face kept smiling at me as if nothing had happened. Did you want to take this to the bedroom, babe? It asked. Fuck no. Do not follow me, you crazy bitch. I ran out of the living room as my mouth throbbed. I made it into the bedroom and headed towards the bathroom, tripping over my clothes and landing on my left knee. I closed my eyes and bit my lip in pain, which only added to the pain that was already there. I cried out as I slowly stood up and leaned against the bathroom counter, looking into the mirror. I looked almost as frightening as Quinn, with a chunk missing off my lip and blood dripping down my chin and throat. It had gotten on my shirt now as well, and I took it off, leaning forward to look at the injury in the mirror. I held my breath as I cleaned the wound to the best of my ability. Once all the blood had been rinsed off, the missing part of my lip looked about 10 times bigger. I grabbed some gauze and pressed it to the wound to try to stop the bleeding. I was getting dizzy. I sat down on the floor of the bathroom, pulling open the cabinets under the sink to grab the bottle of alcohol. I opened it and moved the bottle around under my nose to stop myself from passing out. After a few seconds, the dizziness went away, and I leaned my head back against the wall as I set the alcohol down. I kept pressure on the wound, thinking back to the image of my wife chewing on my skin. When I opened my eyes again, I gasped. Quinn was crouched down right in front of me, leaning in towards my face. I tried to back up, but I was already up against the wall and had nowhere to go. Are you okay? The evil side asked me in a mocking tone. It no longer just looked angry, now it was amused, almost smirking. I'm fine, I replied. Here, let me kiss it better, the other side offered. No, I snapped. She backed up, the good side of her face changing too, into a sad expression. Why don't you want me, Tony? It asked. What? I mumbled. I thought this was what you wanted. You thought this was what I wanted? I asked, motioning at her face. He doesn't like us anymore, the evil side replied, changing into an exaggerated frown. Is that true, Tony? The other side asked. You bit my fucking lip off, I shouted. She stood up and looked down at me. You've done a lot worse to me. This is the least that you could live with. I couldn't tell which side of her face said that, and I didn't really care to know. She left the room then, but neither of us have left the house. Quinn's face is the same, although it goes through moods. Sometimes, she doesn't stop staring at me for hours. She won't even blink. On more than one occasion, I've woken up in the middle of the night to find her hovering a mere few inches over me while she stares. Both sides of her face seem to hate me now for some reason. One morning when I got out of the shower, she was standing in the bathroom doorway holding a knife. I thought for sure she was going to kill me. The evil side of her face looked extra angry that day. I think the only reason she didn't stab me to death was that the opposite side of her was the one holding the knife. Every day I go to work and come home and she's the same. I start sweating as soon as I pull into our neighborhood, and yet I don't know what to do. I think she would track me down if I tried to run. I swear I saw her standing outside of a restaurant last week where I was having a lunch meeting with a client. My wife used to be a nice person, but now I'm terrified of her. I'm a prisoner on death row. They're making us play the Dollhouse Games series. It's easy for someone to plead their innocence, even if they have a hard time believing the words which escape their mouth. It's even easier when your life is on the line in the process. Lying is a fool's game in the eyes of the universe, totally meaningless in its judgment of whether you were good or evil. It's even more foolish when you plead the truth upon the deaf ears of the US judicial system and the con artists who keep it afloat. It doesn't matter who you are, where you came from, what you've been through, or how many witnesses swear you were with them on those nights which coincidence decided you belonged behind bars. I've been condemned to the fringes of society, and I'm disgusted that my death will coincide with the true monsters who walk alongside me. My name is Anthony Bennett, and I'm a free man. Perhaps not in the literal sense, not to the onlookers who only see a haggard, red-headed man pacing the chipped tile of his minuscule cell. No, not to them. But, to me, I couldn't be any more free. In the eyes of what's good and evil, my mind is void of any guilt. If there's an afterlife, which I doubt there will be, I know that I will run through the grassy fields of forever, uninhibited by the machine which dragged me here. This I know to be true. Today would have been my 3rd month and 3rd day awaiting the electric chair on death row. The worry of my name being called at this point, among the dozens of others who have waited several years, was very slim. It's easier for them to draw the process out, to beat the fight out of you so that your death could pass as unceremoniously as possible. It works. As I said, I'm only 3 months in and I've done all the research, presented all the facts, and pleaded my innocence dozens of times. It doesn't matter what you say or how you feel if nobody is listening, especially when there's hundreds of others pleading their case just as loudly. It's a shame that I've been swept under the rug so easily after hearing the other inmates' tales of innocence, of the flawed system. I can't seem to understand how I've been grouped along with these people. Their stories have too many holes, their character issues ever present in the way they carry themselves. I'm not like them and that is why I'm free. Well, I shouldn't say all of them spew total bullshit. Some had good reason to do the things they did, though it doesn't matter when a book decides your fate. If you'll recall, it would have been my 3rd month and 3rd day here with the creatures on death row. However, I'm beginning to think that the place we find ourselves now is much, much worse. I'm not so sure what time it was when the guards ran their nightsticks along the bars of our puny prison cells, creating a symphony of wretched clattering which awoke us. I still remember the moans of my cellmates, pulled back into their hopeless reality with such force that their weary minds had forgotten this bleak place for the first few seconds they regained consciousness. Not me, though. I can't sleep with the lights on, which was the case for the entirety of the previous night because Andy Johnson just had to tell one of the guards he was going to tear his throat out and shit down it. Yep, that'll lose everyone's lights out privileges for the rest of the week. Rise and shine, ladies, rise and shine. A short, husky man bellowed out into the echoing hallway of our block. Troy Bowers was a perfect example of what's wrong with our prison system, allowing the loudest individuals to hold the most control simply because they could talk over everybody else. Nobody dared to say a word, to defy his demeaning attitude lest they wanted to be beaten savagely, so savagely that their body would turn black and blue. I could tell by the panic-stricken faces of the more tenured inmates that something was terribly wrong. Most days we were left in silence, similar to forgotten children's toys. Our only interaction was the regimented feeding schedule and the occasional walks to go shower. Otherwise, it was bad news. Our block was emptied, cuffed and shackled together before being escorted down various hallways of the prison, some I hadn't even seen before. There was no chance to run, no chance to escape as nearly 40 guards marched the 12 of us forward. Truthfully, I was fucking terrified. As we marched along the barren, windowless hallways, my mind conjured up every possible outcome that awaited us on the other side. I was convinced they'd have us lined up and turned into Swiss cheese. It'd be easier to clear house and just be done with a lot of us anyways. That all changed when we reached the tall, heavy double doors at the end of the maze. A small television was implanted into the wall just above the doors. "We are ready to commence the games," the frontmost guard called out. I swear that I could hear his voice crack just a little as he spoke. The screen lit up, offering just one simple word: "Welcome," in a lime-colored, pixelated font. The sounds of the various mechanisms whirring and buzzing could be heard from all around us as the giant doors began to draw themselves open. "What the fuck is TH?" one of the inmates, who I'd come to know as Critter, tried to speak but was quickly subdued by one of the guards. "You keep your goddamn fucking mouth shut, you hear me?" Officer Bowers screeched as he swung his nightstick over Critter's head. Critter never was the sharpest tool in the shed. The hollow sound which bounced off his skull seemed like definitive evidence. Blood poured generously from the crown of his bald head. Had he not been attached to the rest of us, then he would surely have dropped like a fly. Excessive force becomes the status quo on death row, as you can imagine. But even this seemed like too much. The rest of us were silent. Finally, the doors fell completely open. The lights inside the room on the other side were nearly blinding compared to the usual dimness of our block. They marched us onward until the light swallowed us entirely. It took a moment before my eyes could totally adjust to my surroundings, though it felt as if the breath had been torn from my lungs upon seeing the massive extent of the room we found ourselves in. It's hard to gauge just how large it really was. I feel like I've lost scale of things in the past 3 months I've spent in my cell, though if I had to guess I would say it was similar to a sports stadium. Similarly to a stadium, the floor was covered entirely by a thick turf which shone a sickly green color under the bright overhead lights. The walls were covered in poorly painted flowers and trees which crawled to the very edges of the ceiling. It was difficult to make out what the ceiling looked like because of the massive, circular lights which casted blinding rays down upon us. Between the glaring lights I could somewhat make out a childishly painted sun and blue skies dotted with smears of white. In the middle of the room, however, stood a building of its own. On the outside it looked like a giant, pink square without any doors or windows, though the closer they brought us had revealed the rough gray cement which the building was composed of. If the guards hadn't been there to promise us a swift beating, then I'm sure the panic would be even more present than the wide, terrified eyes of my fellow inmates. Critter hung limp by his shackles still, and I was afraid he was already dead, though the true outcome would prove to be far worse. When they brought us here, to the pink building, the same guard called out those familiar words once more, and a piece of the floor began to collapse and pull itself backward underneath the building. A stairway sat below it. As we descended the stairs into this nightmare, that's when Critter awoke. His body seemed to tighten and convulse as he regained consciousness. Thick wads of spit and blood poured from his mouth and began flying aimlessly in great showers as he began to laugh with such uncontrollable joy. I tried my best to ignore it. The other inmates began to panic and writhe in their shackles on cue with Critter's meltdown. That's when a cold, wet rag collapsed mightily over my nose and mouth. Everything went dark. I'm not sure how long I was out for. It didn't seem like long. However, when I awoke I was completely alone, tucked thoroughly into a bed. My mind was in a haze and my body felt numb. But still I shot upward. A desk, much like the one you would use if you were still in grade school, sat across from the bed in my small room. A spiral notebook, the very one I find myself writing in now, was accompanied by a pencil and a tiny wooden box. Inside were a bunch of envelopes. The ceiling was suspended high above me. A single light casting a faint glow illuminated the neat room I found myself in. It wasn't long after I awoke that a soft, mechanical whir began to take effect. A piece of the wall began to pull itself upward to reveal a speaker. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen." An unnaturally deep and distorted voice came from the other side of the speaker. "I'm sure you're all wondering where you are, but don't fret. Let us show you." Somewhere outside of the walls, a buzzer began to cry as one of the sides to my room began to jerk and pull itself up. I think this new reality, this nightmare, really began to take hold once I saw the world on the outside. Behind my wall was a thick sheet of glass. At least I think it's glass. It won't break. About 30 yards across from me was another massive window. One of the other inmates was banging furiously against it. His room looked exactly like mine. To the left and right of his window were two more windows which revealed identical rooms with other inmates inside. Some of them I recognized, others I didn't. I've gathered that we must be on the second floor because 3 more windows and 3 more rooms sit below them, all housing more terrified prisoners. Some of them screamed and tried, to no avail, to break through the glass. Others simply sat or laid still on their beds. I'm not sure if they're still sleeping. The space between the walls was barren, save for a giant, colorful wheel with various symbols attached to each color. Some of these symbols were familiar. One was a spider and another was a thermometer. Others I didn't recognize. "Welcome to the Dollhouse Games." There seemed to be an edge of excitement in the distorted voice. "You all have a debt to society that you will be given the chance to repay. You should consider yourselves lucky," it continued. I looked on at the chaos unfolding around me. Perhaps the shock of it all had induced a sort of calmness, though I couldn't help but notice Critter flailing and writhing painfully in the bottom leftmost room across from me. I think that's what got to me the most in that moment. You each have a notebook in your rooms. On the inside of the cover is the number you will be assigned for these games. Please take a moment to regard this. My legs moved, almost mechanically, under the command of this mysterious voice. I flipped open the cover to the notebook. Inside, written in a fine, black script, read the number 3. "You may write what you please in these notebooks. However, you must seal it in an envelope and place it in the receptacle which will open at the end of each day." The more the voice droned on and the more hysterical I saw the other inmates becoming had begun to take its toll. My heart pounded with untethered ferocity. I was afraid I was about to faint, but I knew I needed to stay calm. There has to be an explanation for all of this. There are 24 participants in this year's Dollhouse Games and only one of you will be leaving. However, there is good news. I found myself trying and failing to not hyperventilate. The reality of our situation began to take hold. This isn't how it's supposed to be. Whoever wins the Dollhouse Games will be allowed their freedom. This means you will have repaid your debt to society, and you will be given a clean slate. My lips and tongue were so horribly dry. I wanted to scream, to beg and plead my innocence to the man behind the speaker. Even then, however, I knew that it was meaningless. Since one of our contestants is already incapacitated, we will use him as an example of how the games will be played. The audio cut out directly after he spoke. I began pacing wildly around my room, looking for any nook or cranny that may house a key or an exit which I could escape from. It was no use. This room is completely and utterly barren of anything other than the desk and the bed. I almost wish they would have just lined us up and shot us dead. Do you have no mercy? A few minutes passed as I sat on the bedside, trying to collect my thoughts and steady my breathing. When I stood up again to face the outside world, I saw two men standing directly next to the spinner wheel in the courtyard. They were adorned in white bodysuits which clung tightly to their skin, their faces obscured by a pink mask with dozens of long ropes of cloth sprouting from their heads and down to their shoulders, sort of like a mass of pink dreadlocks, if that makes more sense. Let the games begin. The speaker came back to life. One of the masked individuals reached a slender arm out to the wheel and gave it a mighty tug. It seemed to spin on and on, the swirl of colors nearly making me vomit from how dizzying it seemed. Finally, it stopped. The symbol which it stopped it was the thermometer I had noticed earlier. A ball, sort of like the balls you see in a game of pool, dropped into a basket from the tube which jetted out below the wheel. The other masked man reached into the basket and pulled it out. Without a moment's hesitation, he raised it to the sky to show us. I could just barely make out the number 17 painted on the white ball. Critter's number. The white-clad men both disappeared from my sight and were replaced now by another mechanical noise. 4 TV screens began to descend from above the courtyard, each one facing one of the dollhouse walls. The screens simply read 5 in an ominous red font, then 459, 458, 457, and so on. It was a timer. The light in Critter's room had turned a similar shade of red which seemed to grow in intensity as the timer counted down. I wasn't sure what the thermometer meant at first. I still wasn't completely sure when Critter had begun to twist and writhe with such ferocity that I was sure his bones would stick out from the skin. However, as I watched closely with sick curiosity, I could see his skin begin to bubble and pop, wisps of smoke escaping the freshly opened sores. Soon, much like the rest of his room, Critter was reduced to a blobby pile of melted, burning flesh and bone. Even through the thick concrete of the dollhouse, of the soundproof windows, I swear I could hear the cries of his unparalleled agony. Player 17 has been eliminated, that familiar voice called out. Truthfully, I hardly noticed the wall to Critter's room collapse back into solid concrete. At this point, it was simply a fight to keep my mind intact. This can't be real, can it? Can anyone help me? This concludes today's games. Please take time to rest and recover as you will all be given a task tomorrow. Thank you for your participation in the Dollhouse games. I've been writing in this notebook since the games ended today. I'm not sure where to go from here. I don't know what any of this means. Just please, if anyone finds this or sees this, please help. Please, please. The slot just opened, so I think I'm through with writing for the day. Again, if anyone finds this, my name is Anthony Bennett. I am innocent. I think my girlfriend is upset with me. It started 3 months ago. I walked into the cafe about a half block from the small publishing company where I work, like I did every day. When I came in, however, I realized my usual barista was nowhere to be seen. In his place stood Claire Richardson. She was taller than me, with neatly braided dirty blonde hair, and a t-shirt for a band I hadn't heard of and gray jeans that seemed well worn, if not vintage. Upon seeing her, I had the immediate feeling that I knew her, despite the fact that we'd never met. Her gaze was warm, comforting, like a fireplace on a cold day. She didn't say a word to me as I approached, or even when I greeted her. I don't know how long we stood in silence looking at each other. I was mesmerized, perplexed by her gaze as I moved towards her. What from afar had seemed to be comfortable immediately became smoldering when I came closer. The warmth turned to full-on heat, and I felt like she was analyzing my every movement, judging the core of my being. When I realized we'd just been staring at each other in silence, I recited my usual coffee order, a medium coffee with room for cream, and she nodded, as if she agreed that the order was correct for how she'd assessed me. As she set to work making it, I noticed the inhuman grace about her, like each step was a dance to music only she could hear. I paid, took my coffee, and left. For the rest of the day, every time my mind wandered from my work, I was in the dimly lit coffee shop under Claire's intense gaze. Life continued on, of course. My usual barista was back the next day, and he told me about the new hire. I tried not to ask too many questions, not to seem like I wanted to know every single thing about her. He told me she had very little coffee experience, but she'd been good with customers, and I wondered if we were talking about the same strange, silent woman. At work, I again could not seem to help from fantasizing about her blue, nearly violet eyes that seemed to contain an inexplicable heat, the all too graceful way she moved. I don't think she said a single word to me the entire time I had been there, as if I had willed it for sheer thinking of her. She was there again the next day. This time she smiled softly when she saw me. Again, she ignored my greeting and made no move to ask for my order. Again I stared, gaped really, at her. She wore a soft pink lipstick today and a dress that hugged her tall figure. Her violet eyes drew me in this time, rather than the immediate heat, and I thought of a frog being slowly boiled alive by the rising heat in a pot. None the wiser, but I knew the heat could kill me. That was the difference. I'd come back and looked for her, had hoped desperately to see her again, despite the strange sick feeling she always seemed to leave me with. She smiled wider, interrupting my inner monologue, and reached suddenly behind the counter. Silently, she handed me a medium cup of coffee with room for cream. She'd remembered my order. More than that, she'd remembered when I'd come in. I'd have been flattered if I weren't so afraid. I took the coffee from her, handed her a bill before even hearing my total, and briskly left the shop. I got halfway to work before I noticed that she'd written her number on the paper cup. I don't remember texting her, in all honesty. I can't recall making plans to meet at the park after work, only that the magnetic force that seemed to follow her called me there. The end of my day couldn't come fast enough, and I wondered idly if she was waiting there for me. The thought filled me equally with excitement and dread. At 4 o'clock, I could no longer handle the wait and told a bad excuse to my supervisor about picking my nephew up from school. We both knew it was an obvious lie, but I also knew that I rarely called out, rarely even took a sick day. She let me go without a fuss, and I walked briskly to the park, each step bringing more excitement tinged with nervousness. She was waiting for me, of course, at exactly the bench I'd pictured her at. She looked absolutely serene, and even more strikingly beautiful in the daylight. Beautiful, but odd, as if she'd been somehow photoshopped into reality, like she didn't belong on a park bench. When I approached, she shut up, gently taking my hand and walking alongside me. It took a minute before the shock wore off and I realized that she still hadn't said a word to me. In fact, I hadn't said a word to her either. We walked in comfortable silence, hand in hand, for over 2 hours. Sometimes one of us would stop to admire some flowers or pull the other gently towards the lake in the center of the park, but neither of us felt the need to speak. It was almost as if we really did know each other without a single word. Every time I looked up into her violet eyes, they were focused on me, and what I thought at first to be judging turned into simple acknowledgement. She knew me inside and out, knew my likes and dislikes, knew my hopes and cares and loved ones. She knew me, and she accepted me exactly as I am, and in that knowing I felt that I too knew her. As the streetlights illuminated and the sun fell behind the trees, I noticed she'd led me gently out of the park. And that was the first night I went home with Claire Richardson. Her house was old, but not in disrepair. It was tidy and small and intimate. As she led me in, hand in hand, I noticed how well curated her home was, as if each object had been hand-selected just for her. The hardwood that creaked softly under our weight, the many windows that had a view of her quaint backyard, the walls that were painted bold colors and lined with notes and flyers and posters, too many to count. The lights themselves were dim, but candles sat on every surface, and I knew that if she cared to light them, the house would glow with light. It smelled everywhere of incense and dried herbs. She neatly detached her hand from mine to begin the process of lighting candles, and as she did so, her blonde hair looked golden in the dim light. Her odd violet eyes flashed up to me, and in an instant she wrapped her arms around my waist and kissed me, a soft, gentle, goodnight kiss that was at once comforting and a little off-putting. Her skin was just a bit too cold as it pressed to mine, in contrast to her still flaming eyes. It was something that I don't think I'd normally recognize so immediately, but because so many things about her were so strange, I took immediate notice. As abruptly as it had begun, it ended, and she pulled away from me. She grasped my shoulder and led me through her doorway, sending me on my way back to my comparatively dreary apartment. I had very little sleep, but when I managed to drift off, I dreamt of violet seas that wanted all too much to draw me in. She wasn't at the coffee shop the next day. I had the thought to check the park before work, but it seemed odd to check the only other place I'd seen her. An intrusive thought told me that I could always check her house, and I hated thinking it, hated imagining how easy it could be to climb from the tiny backyard through one of the windows. Ask why she wasn't at work. That was insane, and I knew it. I trudged through my workday, wishing I knew where she was. I could text her, but that would break the lovely silence we'd cultivated. When 5 o'clock finally came around, I all but bolted out of the building. She stood waiting at the front door. It was as if my body knew before my mind that she'd be there, waiting for me just as the day before. Beautiful in a way that told me she just didn't fit into her surroundings, a nearly perfect puzzle piece that somehow didn't belong. She smiled at me again, and it alleviated any suspicions of wrongdoing. How could this gorgeous woman do anything untoward? I took her hand, just as she'd taken mine, and gently led her to my apartment. While not as stunning as her house, I thought my apartment had a sort of charm. It was a tad new age for my taste. An ex-girlfriend has a habit of buying crystals and woven rugs that still littered my coffee tables and floors. I'd had the forethought to clean the night before, and it had proven correct. She sat delicately on my couch, patting the space next to her. I obliged and sat beside her, turning on the first movie that popped up on my screen. I think we both knew that the movie was background noise, something to nurture our shared silence. When the movie began, I glanced to her and she softly rested her head on my shoulder. I felt my arm move around her shoulders as naturally as if it had acted of its own accord. It was a gesture of comfort, of happiness. She fell asleep there, leaning against me. When it grew late, I scooped her up and gently put her in my bed, wrapping blankets around her. As I turned back to leave the room, I felt her hand grasping mine. I picked it up gently and kissed it. She did not loosen her grip, and in fact began to pull me into bed with her. I fell asleep that night holding her, and awoke the next morning to find she'd already left. We went on like that, trading houses each day. She left sticky notes covering my walls, letters and recipes and to-do lists. I began to buy books I wanted her to read and filled her bookshelf that had once been used for trinkets. We stayed in together on days off, gardening in her backyard or going on walks or listening to music. Sometimes, when she thought I was asleep or otherwise occupied, she'd go into her living room and gently practice piano. I could go into detail on our day-to-day, but I want to keep the happy memories to myself. 2 weeks ago, it happened. We'd been sitting together, each reading in separate chairs in her living room. The rain outside pounded and there were candles lit all around us. I looked up and caught her gazing at me, absolutely content. In that moment, I knew that my love for her dwarfed any joy I'd ever felt, and I knew that she felt the same. I shuddered. The joy was unnatural in its intensity, so much so that I felt a rush of nausea. No living thing should hold such power, should witness such glorious beauty. No living person deserved to. Our beautiful, all-encompassing, deafening silence had made us know each other so intimately that I knew with perfect clarity that we experienced these events in unison. Her eyes were intense, and as she looked at me, a grim smile began to grow upon her beautiful face. Neither of us said a word, but she reached her unrealistically graceful hand to mine and squeezed it gently. Once, and then she opened her mouth slowly, as if any sudden move could scare me away. "I'll give you a head start," she whispered. That was all it took for the game to begin. I bolted out the door and through the pouring rain, thinking quickly on where I could hide. My apartment was out. She'd expect it. I'd need a stronger weapon than I had on hand, which was simply a small knife I used to open boxes. I knew that she'd hunt me down, or I'd hunt her, and eventually one of us would be caught and simply cease to exist. Our love was too pure, too all-knowing to exist, and we both were practical enough to know the true solution, that there just wasn't space for two perfect halves of anything or anyone. In my rush to get away, I saw the perfect opportunity, the movie theater where we'd had our 5th date. We'd seen a horror movie and she'd held my hand. I ducked behind the concession counter and waited. She came for me, of course. The door creaked open and I heard her graceful, nearly silent steps up to the counter. I still don't know what my plan was. As she approached the counter, I leapt from behind it and grabbed her sopping wet, neatly braided hair. I used it as a handle to slam her face into the counter, and she actually screamed. I hadn't been expecting that, couldn't even imagine her screaming. I was so used to our silence that it had become fact rather than choice. Nevertheless, she screamed as I slammed her face into the counter again and again. I remember thinking that it couldn't be possible that so much blood came from one body, and yet there it was. I had expected her to put up a fight, to yell at me, to do something, but she didn't. I pulled her swollen but still lovely face away from the counter, just barely conscious, and whispered "I love you" before promptly snapping her neck and ending her misery. The snap it made was heart-wrenchingly lovely, as everything she touched had been. It pained me to see that beauty burned out, but I knew as well as I could know anything that had the roles been reversed, she would have done the same. My beauty, my light, had finally gone dark and I was left alone, back into my lightless world. Not knowing what else to do, I scooped her lifeless body into my arms as I had so many months ago, and I carried her back to her home. Our garden had just started to thrive, and it hurt me to dig back up the plants we'd buried together, but I knew that it's what she would have wanted. Burying her took nearly until morning, and I was exhausted by the time the sun had begun to rise. There was nothing to be done. I showered and got ready for another day at work, deciding to skip coffee for the time being. By the time I came home from work, the news had begun over-dramatizing the blood left on the concession counter from last night's argument. The police suspected foul play for obvious reasons, but had no idea whom the victim could be at this time. I knew when the samples were tested they'd come back as her, but I was unafraid. I knew Claire hadn't gone to work in some time. Knew she didn't have many friends. If she had family to speak of, they weren't close. She'd had a funny way of isolating herself in such a way that this ending truly seemed to fit her. But then I guess the same could be said of me. That was 2 weeks ago. Tonight, I felt cooped up all alone inside the space I once shared with Claire and decided to go out on the town. After wandering idly, I found an art gallery having an event and decided to mingle. It was there that I met her, Claire Richardson. She was shorter than me, with dark hair cropped short and paint-splattered skinny jeans. I almost wouldn't have known it was her, that is, until I saw that strange fire yet again behind her emerald eyes. I made a mental note to take things slowly this time, enjoy her company for as long as I could. I approached her, and she asked if it was my first time going to a gallery opening. She hadn't seen me around. That was odd. Each time I'd met Claire, she'd greeted me with silence. Nevertheless, I told her truthfully that the art within the gallery spoke to me, and that I'd felt almost called to this gallery opening. It was then that she asked if I knew any of the victims that the paintings were commemorating. She asked me if I'd heard of the serial killer terrorizing young women in the area, and when I hadn't, she'd told me to stay safe. As the night progressed, she'd asked if she could walk me home, quoting safety in numbers. The concept was laughable, despite the fact that we both were young women. She was small and wiry, and most likely not carrying any weapon. I knew just from how she looked at me that my safety wasn't her only objective. I obliged, and we strolled back to my house. After I invited her in for tea, she seemed perplexed, maybe even put off by the posters and notes and flyers that hung on the walls of my apartment. She asked if I'd ever met anyone by the name of Bridget and said that my home reminded her of something she'd have liked. She'd said she worked briefly with Bridget at a coffee shop, but Bridget had stopped showing up. Bridget had been the victim of the murder Claire had earlier told me about. Claire left quickly and without comment, and I'm not sure now how to repair our relationship. How can I reassure Claire that I've never met anyone named Bridget, and that she's the one I love, have always loved? Why is Claire so upset with me after this fight when we've been through so much together? Can you hear me? I lost my sense of hearing 5 years and 11 months ago. Me and my sister decided to go on a camping trip for our upcoming 25th birthday. I never really enjoyed the outdoors, but she loved it. She always told me that the night sky burning with balls of fire would turn me around on it. She always phrased things so weirdly. I brushed it off as another quirk, but there was something in her eyes I couldn't quite recognize. I wish I vetoed it. We got there about a week later. My first red flag should have been that there weren't any other tents, camper vans, or even people around for miles. My sister, Emily, told me that there would be a group of people here with designated spots. I suppose she wanted to calm my nerves. Can you hear me? I brushed it off and started to set up camp. Emily offered to do it, but I needed to busy my own hands. It was getting late because I wanted to be there as little as possible. Emily decided to sleep early. That's when I heard it, a rustle in the tree line. I grabbed the torch I packed, cursing to myself I didn't splurge for the more powerful one. And that's when I heard it. Can you hear me? I shouted out that I could, worried that maybe it was someone that gotten lost. Someone Emily stated was supposed to be here. As I was going to grab my phone, I clutched my head in pain. My ears started bleeding and I must have been shouting. My throat felt like it was ripping itself out. And then I passed out. I lost my eyesight 5 years and 7 months ago. Our camping trip was cut early, of course, Emily told me, through a series of hastily written "Can you hear me?" Post-it notes that there was nothing there that day, nothing she could hear at the very least before my scream. She was the one who called the ambulance, of course. I stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. I needed some psych evaluations as well as physical treatment, of course, but the doctors told me there was nothing wrong and concluded that whatever I saw, I must have tripped and fell. And whatever happened to my brain was causing this, that it would be temporary and life moved on. I was sitting in my apartment. I'm not sure what struck me to do it, but I decided to research into whatever I saw. Can you hear me? I remember getting a glimpse of it before hearing it. It looked like static on a television screen, but instead of gray and white, it was pure black, with the fur having an electricity current running through it the whole time. The jaw looked barren, like it had no lips. I know that it had teeth on the lower jaw, but I can't seem to remember how I know. Its eyes were sunken in, a dim white light coming from within them, and its nose concaved in on itself. I also remember it was tall and spindly. It looked like it could wrap itself around the tree and blend in with the shadows. Maybe I remember this so vividly because it's the last thing I saw that night, not on the computer, in my apartment, with me. I had gone to get a snack after turning up nothing, and its head was in my fridge. I recoiled in terror before the light in my eyes shut out. I lost my taste 3 years ago. Without my eyesight and without my hearing, I had to get someone to help me. My family had all but abandoned me at this point. My sister celebrated her last birthday alone. I hated it. She was the reason I was in this mess in the first place. The nurse they hired to live in with me was a nice woman. Doreen, she seemed to have endless patience as she told me her stories through a series of taps to my shoulder. Can you hear me? I could get used to the routine by the time the day came around. 2 years and 4 months of this when she brushed my elbow 2 times. That meant it was time for food. I hardly even noticed her fingers seemed longer than usual. I mean, can you blame me? I thought I was going crazy, maybe I am. But I ignored it. The first few months I needed help getting used to navigating my apartment, but I was able to feed myself just fine. At this point I grabbed a forkful of what we were eating. Judging by the toughness, I imagined a steak. Bringing it up to my mouth, I bit down. Do you ever imagine tasting a gone-off cheese? One that had been sitting in the sun way too long, stepped on by everyone without them noticing, scrapped off the ground and served to you. This was that, but 1,000 times worse. I was almost thankful I couldn't taste it anymore. I didn't bother going to the hospital this time. Taste was hurtful to lose, but I could live with it. Can you hear me? I mean, I adapt. That's how you stay alive. I lost my sense of smell 4 months ago. I never mentioned my taste to anyone. I thought day in and day out about these things. And there was one thing I noticed. It was when I reacted to whatever it was that I lost it. I had smelled the odor about a week before it got me. I tested my hypothesis. Doreen couldn't smell it, or obviously she would react to the smell of a rotting corpse within my living room. I thought, maybe if I ignore it, it'll go away, but it only seemed to be getting worse with time. I was holding on until the corpse moved. I was able to locate where it was, if only because it was so strong. And it moved. It got into my face. This creature, whatever it was, seemed to be changing the odor to whatever I hated the most, like it was in my brain. Can you hear me? I couldn't help myself. I vomited. I lost my sense of touching 10 minutes ago. It was when I was writing this. I brushed up against one of those damn fingers. You might be thinking, how am I typing all this? Before everything, I was coding. I did it day in and day out, and I know my keyboard like the back of my hand. I also know there isn't a finger beside the C key. Can you hear me? It felt like it was fighting to take control. I knew it upon first touch. It's been here the entire time. I've just been blind to it unless it wants me to notice. And the shock, and I mean actual shock, burning my finger, I couldn't stop myself from reacting. But it's okay, I haven't been able to feel pain for 14 minutes. Can you hear me? Has it been 14 minutes? It's getting difficult to tell. Listen, Doreen's gone. I came here asking for help. I can't feel hunger or thirst or pain or anything. Please, I need you. It's here. It can affect me. It can feed me anything, and it can drain me of my very essence. I came here to give my address, but I can't remember it. Somewhere in Maine, I think. Hell, I don't even know if I'm typing the right keys. I can't think straight. I think it's taking everything, taking me over. I did this a lot, so I know how to post. Please tell me you'll find this. Remember, just answer it. Can you hear me? My plane landed at an airport that doesn't exist. I'm never giving up my seat for cash again. I want to tell you about something that happened to me very recently so you can hopefully avoid the same experience that I had. I hadn't flown in several years, otherwise maybe this would have all struck me as odd much sooner than it did. I was flying home from visiting a friend in New York and my flight was very overbooked. There had been cancellations, too, so the gate area was packed with people anxiously hoping for a seat. Since I was traveling by myself and didn't have to go back to work for a few days, I happily accepted cash to take a later flight. I wasn't in a rush and hadn't checked a bag, so at the time it seemed well worth the couple of hours wait for the amount that they offered me. They drew a strange symbol on the back of my hand when I accepted the payment. It was dark and looping, drawn on thickly, and it captivated me as my eyes felt the need to trace the flow of the lines over and over. I figured at the time that it was intended to give some indication to employees, perhaps to prevent me from trying to keep getting more money. Or vouchers if my next flight was also full. I ended up having no trouble getting on my later flight. Looking back, that was strange. For starters, quite a people accepted cash, credit, and vouchers, and there were multiple cancellations, so it should have been fairly full. But I was the only one in my entire row, across the aisle, too. There were maybe 15 people on the entire flight. It was so empty that we could have each had our own private row of seats if we chose to. Otherwise, it was an uneventful flight. I had dozed off and woke up well after we landed to a flight attendant shaking my shoulders frantically. Her face had a strange expression on it, like a mixture of annoyance and deeply seated fear. All the other passengers were long gone. As I grabbed my backpack and headed towards the door, the small flight crew lined up to see me off the plane, which in itself wasn't too bizarre. But they seemed anxious. Some were checking their watches while others rocked back and forth nervously. I received pats on the back, an annoyed glare from the lady who had woken me up, one tearful smile, and then the pilot thanked me for my gift. I figured at the time they had confused me with someone much more important than I am. Now, I understand. As soon as my backpack had cleared the main cabin door, they closed it again behind me so fast that it almost hit me. As I left the jetway, I noticed that something was very wrong. Firstly, this wasn't my airport, and this airport looked run down, if not totally abandoned. I looked at my new ticket nervously, and sure enough it had an airport code I'd never seen on it. I felt like an idiot for not paying more attention when I took the cash and was given the new boarding pass. I had wrongly assumed I was going to be flying into the same airport, just on a later flight, especially since the employee booking it had confirmed the city, and the marquee at the gate had listed the correct city on it, too. Granted, there are 2 airports near my home, but either of those would have been fine, and this was not one of them. I frantically looked around for someone that could help get me to the right place, but there wasn't another soul in sight. No passengers waiting to board, no one from my flight, no employees. I was completely alone. I could hear a faint, sharp, scraping sound. The plane had begun to pull away. They hadn't even waited for someone to move the jet bridge away from the plane first. I was in a strange airport, and I looked to be totally alone. I pulled out my phone to see where the hell I was, and not only was there no Wi-Fi available, I didn't have data either. I sighed and resigned myself to wandering the terminal for any sign of life. It'd be a long night, but I'd figure out a way to get home, I told myself. Probably. I think I was too tired to be alarmed at that point. I finally began to take in my surroundings. I was in a beautiful, if dated terminal. My eyes were drawn to gold relief art along the walls. It was really unique. Though as I approached and began to make out the details, I personally thought that the scene it depicted was far too disturbing to be on display in a public space like this. An odd-looking creature seemed to be tearing a man apart, while weird figures looked on. This airport looked to be completely abandoned. There was no power. Instead, the last of the light streaming in through large windows of intricately patterned stained glass painted everything a deep red hue. Ceiling tiles were strewn about, and some rested upon the dilapidated seats. My sense of unease grew the longer I took in my surroundings. There was something reverent about the place. It was almost church-like. But I shivered. My gut told me that nothing holy had ever dwelt here. It smelled faintly of fire. The fabric chairs had also taken up the scent. On the ground, there was a thick gray dust as far as my eyes could see. The dark powder crept into my sandals and had settled onto seats and countertops, and even the crevices within the art along the walls. I noticed the footprints of my fellow passengers and figured I'd follow them to find my way out, since the exit and other signs were either damaged or totally non-existent. After a point, the footprints began to diverge as the others looked to have gone in different directions. I noticed that one group had headed off towards what I guessed to be more gates, down a long, darkened tunnel. I stared for a while, but I couldn't see an end to the darkness, since the last of the light outside was fading quickly, and there seemed to be no power. I decided that route wasn't for me. I followed the other group's prints that went the opposite direction, towards a more open lobby. Eventually, the footprints began to tell a story that confused and frightened me. At one point, an additional set of prints had joined this group, as if someone or something had emerged out nowhere and begun walking on all fours or crawling alongside them. Soon after, the passengers' footprints became erratic. They must have started running in different directions. I followed a couple, but eventually, each pair of human footprints ended abruptly, as if they'd been plucked right out of existence. It was so quiet. I wondered, had none of the other passengers made it out? I suddenly heard movement directly above me, a scratching sound like something was being dragged along the ceiling, or crawling. I didn't even look up, just sprinted back the way I had come. After getting what I deemed a safe distance away, I allowed myself a glance back. Something lithe-looking and shadowy was moving along the ceiling above where I had been. It eventually disappeared back into a hole left by a fallen ceiling tile. I was back near the stained glass windows and gold art where I had first deplaned. The dusk had faded away unnaturally quickly, and in the burgeoning darkness, I noticed something odd about the night sky. It wasn't like sky I could see from home. It was too clear. There was no light pollution, and I could see more stars than I'd ever seen before. It was as if there wasn't a single light in existence. I steeled myself, fueled by my growing sense of unease, and reluctantly decided I'd try heading through the tunnel. As I approached and my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something strange up ahead of me. It was unlike anything I had seen before, but seemed to be some sort of living creature, and it was cradling one of the passengers on my flight. It was smooth and seamless looking, but the more I stared, the less the details seemed to make sense. Limbs and features didn't line up with the body. They swirled and shifted and had only a vague suggestion of form, but the pieces never fully connected. The only thing I could clearly see was the same symbol I had on my hand, looked to be carved into what I presumed to be the torso of this thing. Looking at the creature gave me a stabbing headache. Even now, I can't fully describe what I saw, just bits and pieces, long thin appendages that seemed to flow in and out of existence, a featureless face with indentations where features should be. Its head made me think of someone fighting to inhale through a black plastic bag. It was bent in such an unnatural way that I imagined it at its full height was more than the airport could contain. The passenger thrashed in its grip and let out a haunting sound, like the last breath was being pulled from his lungs, as he slowly shriveled into nothingness before my eyes. The creature in response gave a deep sigh that seemed to indicate contentment, and I once more smelled that acrid burning smell. The man crumbled like the dust that coated the floor, and soon what was left of him commingled with it. They had become one and were indistinguishable. I thought about the thick ashy dust I was ankle deep in, and how I could feel it in my sandals, between my toes. As things began to click into place, I felt sick and longed for nothing more than to be safe at home and throw my sandals as far away from me as possible. I gasped unintentionally, understanding 2 seconds too late that if it hadn't already seen me, I had just revealed my location. It began to move closer, and I realized then, in a moment of panicked clarity, that I knew of a door to outside. Granted, it'd probably be a 10-foot drop to the ground, but that seemed a hell of a lot more appealing than sharing the man's fate that I had just witnessed. I ran, shuffling through the ash back towards the jetway and closed the door behind me. It was almost more habit than anything, as I highly doubted the door would be able to hold something like that back. When I got to the end, despite the clear, deep night I had seen from the terminal, I could see a grassy field lit by the setting sun through the opening. There was no runway or any other visual cue that I was at an airport. There were just scrubby trees and yellowed grass burnt by the summer heat for as far as my eyes could see. It looked like home. I tried to reach it, but couldn't. It was like hitting an invisible wall. I thought for a moment and then tried my other hand. I realized that everything except my marked hand could pass through. I rubbed at it, but it was drawn in thick black lines using permanent marker. Of course, I scrubbed for what felt like an eternity, and I tried not to picture that monster emerging from the door to the terminal, shifting, liquid-like, its massive body blocking all escape as it closed in. I rubbed more frantically. By the time I heard the jet bridge protest against the creature's weight, I was half resigned to the fact that I'd never leave. Thinking how terrible it would be to die now at the doorway. I was so close, I could see the pinks and orange of the sunset on the plains and the world just beyond my grasp. My world. I wildly thought for a moment about how animals caught in a trap would bite through flesh, bone, tendons to escape, and I felt a sort of morbid kinship with them. I considered that for a moment and realized I was being ridiculous. I didn't need to bite off my hand. Just a part of it. As it closed the distance between us, I had started to make progress, and its proximity encouraged me to move faster and fight through the pain. To my immense surprise, once it had nearly reached me, it stopped. It didn't pursue me further or move to grab me. It just watched me. A sort of intelligence emanated from it. It seemed to be studying me, waiting. Finally, the symbol was gone. I spat off to the side and I reached my stinging, dripping hand through. To my immense relief, it worked. I jumped out with the goal of rolling into soft landing, but instead painfully hit the ground. There was no jet bridge or airport where I was now. I was flat on my back in a field staring at the open sky. The last thing I saw of the creature were several black fluid-like limbs floating against the colorful sky of my world, as it must have been tentatively reaching out the door I had jumped through. It never fully emerged, likely bound in place the same way I had been only moments earlier. I was able to get home. I was actually only several miles from a road. It turns out there had been an airport in that exact spot that was demolished decades ago, replaced by the larger airport I typically fly into. But even knowing that, nothing I experienced really makes any more sense to me. The only comfort I eventually found was that it didn't follow me. It probably can't get out, right? I didn't know my ex-boyfriend was dead when he texted me. It had been 6 weeks since I broke up with Mike. We'd been having issues for months, but I wasn't able to get over the fact that he shut me out of his life throughout the entirety of our relationship. For reference, we're both men and we were together for 2 years. He wasn't out to his friends or family, so nobody in his life knew we were even together. It was the reason why I was the last one to find out about his death, so I feel like I need to elaborate on that. Well, that, and I blocked him on all my social media accounts. But I didn't block his number. Saturday 2:51 AM. Mike, are you awake? Me, why are you texting me? Mike, I miss you. Me, whatever game you think you're playing, I'm not interested. If you're drunk and need help, I can book an Uber for you. Otherwise, don't text me again. No response. I shrugged it off and tried to distract myself with some Netflix. He was probably just looking for a booty call. I ended up falling asleep 2 hours later. The next day, I met up with my best friend for brunch. She was probably the only thing that kept me together through the breakup. I don't know what I would have done without her. We met at a little cafe in our neighborhood. The first thing she did was ask me why I didn't get any sleep. I swear, nothing could get past this woman. I was just binging TVD again, I said. What's wrong? She sounded more concerned now. Jane, it's nothing. I just had to finish up some work and I had a hard time falling asleep afterward. I insisted. She didn't sound convinced. Our coffee arrived and I practically chugged the damn thing. Jane knew that I only ever watched TVD when something was troubling me. I could feel her gaze on me from behind my cup. Lee, I know you, and I know when something's bothering you. She pushed further. Jane wasn't exactly Mike's biggest fan, and for good reason. But that was precisely why I had a hard time opening up to her about him. I knew that she would never judge me. I just didn't know if she would understand why I responded to his text messages in the first place. The truth is, I still had feelings for him and it's hard to admit that to anybody. I decided to show her the text messages. She remained quiet for a while before finally responding. You know, it's okay if you still care about him. I get that, I do. Do you want some advice or do you just need someone to listen? What she said shocked me. I have this bad habit of thinking the worst of people even if I know that they have good intentions. I guess trauma does that to you. Advice, I decided. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding in. I need to stop pushing people away. Like I said, it's okay to care about him. I just don't think it's a good idea to let him back into your life again. Ultimately, it's up to you. But given his track record, I would highly recommend against it. She held my hand as she said this. Thanks, I know. I just feel like we didn't have the closure we needed, I said hesitantly. Honestly, I kept wishing he would show up at my doorstep and beg me to take him back at some point. But I moved to a new apartment 2 weeks ago and he doesn't know my new address, so that would have been impossible now. I was never going to say that out loud, though. If that's what you need to get over him, then go for it. We talked a bit more over brunch, eventually said our goodbyes, then I went home. My dog, Kaya, greeted me at the door, wagging her tail happily. I was glad I had someone to go home to. I gave her a gentle pat on the head as I set my stuff down on the kitchen counter. The rest of the day was uneventful, and I fell asleep on the couch while watching a movie. I woke up at around 3 a.m. when my phone dinged. Sunday, 3:03 a.m. Mike, I know you said not to text you again, but I really need to talk to you. Me, what could you possibly need to talk about at 3 in the morning? Mike, I don't mean right now but in person. I don't like how he ended things. My heart skipped a beat. I was just talking to Jane about that yesterday. It was kind of weird that he brought that up so soon after I had that conversation. But then again, I felt the exact same way. I just don't know if I want to tell him that. My phone dinged again. Mike, can I see you? Me, fine. You can come over tomorrow, but I recently moved. It might be a bit of a drive for you. Mike, that's all right. I texted him my new address and he said he'll see me soon. I went back to sleep when our conversation ended. When I woke up, the sun had just started to rise. I was kind of expecting not to get much sleep anyway. I got ready for the day and had some breakfast. I decided to take my dog to the park to clear my head. I still wasn't sure if seeing Mike again was a good idea. What if we just ended up sleeping together or something? Or worse, got back together? My thoughts started to spiral. Something in the corner of my eye snapped me out of it. It was like I was being watched, but barely. I was sitting on a bench while passively watching Kaya run around with the other dogs. It felt like someone was behind the tree past the bench beside me. I decided to take a peek, but no one was there. I chalked it up to not getting enough sleep for the past 2 nights in a row. Come on, Kaya, time to go. I called to her. She ran toward me happily and I gave her some treats and a hug before getting up to leave. Nothing really happened on the walk home, but I still couldn't shake that feeling the whole time. Needless to say, I was relieved when I got to my apartment. That relief didn't last. Sunday, 10:17 a.m. Richard, hey Lee, it's Richard. I'm not sure if you remember me. We met at Mike's party a few months ago. It was a Facebook message from Mike's brother. Me, hi, yes, I remember. What's up? Richard, this might be a bit overdue, but honestly, between the funeral and the grieving, it's been kind of hard to get the news out to some of Mike's newer friends. I just wanted to let you know he passed away last weekend. I almost wanted to ask him if he was sure. Luckily, I stopped myself in time. That would have been insensitive. Of course he was sure. Me, I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you for taking the time to let me know. Sorry if this comes across as insensitive, but can I ask who currently has his phone? Richard, we never found it. Actually, it probably got lost in the accident. Did you need something from it? Me, no, he just had a few photos from an old trip with some friends. But it's not important. Richard, well, I'll let you know if it ever turns up. Me, that won't be necessary, but thank you. What the actual fuck? I tried to rack my brain for some type of logical explanation. Maybe Richard was playing some sort of messed up prank. But I seriously doubt that. Maybe someone else found Mike's phone and decided to pull a prank on me. Whatever it was, I felt sick. Then I remembered, whatever sicko had his phone had my address now too. I packed mine and Kaya's stuff and called Jane. I told her I needed a place to stay for a few days and she didn't even ask me why. Just said I can stay as long as I need to. She's a lifesaver, maybe even literally, given the situation. I wasted no time and bolted the hell out of there. When I arrived, Jane asked me if everything was alright. I told her I might have a stalker situation and would need to move. She was extremely worried and said I needed to call the police. I was seriously considering it, but I don't even know how I would go about explaining this situation. They might not even take me seriously. After dinner, Jane set me up on the couch and then excused herself to the bedroom. Kaya was asleep on the floor next to the couch. I couldn't fall asleep. I went through my photos of Mike and started crying. I couldn't believe he was actually gone. I couldn't believe someone was sick enough to pretend to be him. I got an app notification from the doggy cams I set up around the apartment for Kaya. It said it detected movement. My stomach started doing somersaults and I could barely stop myself from puking, but I needed to check it out. I opened the app. My heart was racing when I saw what was on the screen. There, in my living room, was a man I had never seen before in my life. He was extremely thin, like he hadn't eaten in weeks. His hair was dark and long, not like Mike's short blonde hair. But more than that, he didn't look right. Ding, Monday 3:09 a.m. Mike, where are you? My uncle disappeared into an imaginary world of his own creation. Since I was a little kid, my great-uncle Ivan has lived with us in our basement. He's a surrealist painter by trade and his works are beautifully done, whimsical, and thought-provoking oil masterpieces worthy of being stared at for hours. Each time I look at one of his paintings, I find something new that I never noticed before. Uncle Ivan is the most talented artist I've ever met, and yet his work is not even known to the most obscure collectors. I wonder sometimes if he'll be like Van Gogh, and nobody will know properly of his genius until after he's gone. When he had a stroke and lost the ability to speak, he began painting obsessively, showing the world the beauty in his mind which would otherwise be lost without words. My parents built him a studio in the backyard for his 70th birthday. They have friends in construction and we have a large property in the country, so they built him a very big studio with high ceilings, knowing that he would find a way to utilize every inch available. And utilize it he did. The walls were painted white with primer and then he set himself to work. Inside the massive space he created another world. Within a year his designs were outlined in black and white, with splashes of color beginning to be applied in places. Already the overall effect was astonishing. It was like entering the surreal space of his own mind, an Alice in Wonderland world that sparked the imagination and resembled the uncanny landscape of dreams long forgotten. It was when the colors were completely filled in that the illusion became complete. And one day I went outside to his workspace in the backyard to find that he had vanished. He was gone, and I could make no sense of it. Uncle Ivan, I called out in the empty, echoing studio, but he didn't answer. I gazed around in total wonderment at the huge room he had painted once again. The walls, ceiling, and floor alive with colors and images. I tried to find a spot of black and white where he still had to fill in color and could find none. The field of mushrooms with its gnome inhabitants was so real it felt like I could step into it and join in the merriment of the fairy folks living there. Purple cloud mountains rose up steeply to the left of that, a field of pink cherry blossom trees sloping downward on the other side towards a tumbling river the color of cotton candy. This led into a sprawling desertscape which started out in yellows, oranges, and golds and faded softly into the greens and gentle blues of an ocean filled with kelp, octopus, jellyfish, and a myriad of other fantastical aquatic creatures. Gasping, I realized the room was finally complete. My heart thumped in my chest as I thought about what this meant. This had been my Uncle Ivan's life for the past several years. Now it was finished and he should have been reveling in his masterpiece. I thought he would have at least come to find me, to show me that it was done. He knew I was his biggest fan, after all. Where was he? The man was a total recluse, a hermit. He never left the property no matter what, and often spent days straight in his studio, working on the all-encompassing mural. I walked around the fantastical space, becoming lost in the swirling colors and dreamlike images. Even the floors were painted, making it feel like you were completely immersed in the beautiful fantasy world my uncle had made. A sound of birds chirping came from nearby and I looked up with surprise, wondering how they could have gotten into the workshop. When I gazed up and looked around, my heart skipped a beat, and then another. My knees buckled and I sat down hard, my jaw snapping shut with the impact. The moist grass was beneath me, despite never having left the studio. Strangely, the grass was crimson red, the color of fresh blood. Insects I didn't recognize were scurrying in it, crawling up my arm. They were colorful and otherworldly, leaving rainbow-patterned footprints in their wake. The field of towering mushrooms stood in front of me and it was actually there. It wasn't just an illusion of perspective and artistic mastery anymore. I could feel fresh air on my face and heard birds chirping all around me. There was the sound of a flute playing in the distance ahead and gnomes were dancing merrily and singing beneath the shade of mushroom cap roof. Purple clouds floated in the sky and a giant eyeball looked down at me like the moon, winking when it saw me. Too scared to scream, I began hyperventilating. Terrified, my eyes started to search for an exit but found no way out. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" a voice asked from nearby. It sounded familiar, but I couldn't place where I had heard it before. "I thought you'd like it," my great-uncle Ivan said, reaching out his hand to help me to my feet. "Most people didn't understand what I was doing out here, but I could see that you got it from the very beginning. You knew what the purpose of it all was." Standing to my feet, my terror began to evaporate and I felt a smile spread across my face, despite the surreal situation I had found myself in. "Uncle Ivan, you can talk." It had been so many years since I'd heard the old man's voice, I'd forgotten what it sounded like. "I can," he said, looking pleased. "At least while I'm here, but that's always been the case. Come on, let's go for a walk." We started ambling towards the mushroom village up ahead. The music of lutes and flutes and drums became louder, the gentle tones of singing voices rising up to greet us. "I miss talking to you, Uncle Ivan," I said after a minute of silent walking. "That's funny, we haven't really said anything yet." We both chuckled at that. Well, it's hard to find someone you're just as comfortable being quiet around as you are talking. And to be honest, I'm not really sure what to say after seeing all this. "How long have you been coming to this place?" "Off and on for about a year. It was more off than on at first. Every time I came across a patch of black and white, it brought me out of it again. But the more I filled in, the longer I got to stay." I thought about this for a minute. "It's all the way filled in now. Does that mean?" Before I could finish my thought, he interrupted, pointing up at the sky and putting his arm around me. "Look, Jordan, it's the spectral dragon. That's what I've been calling it, anyways." A creature came up over the purple cloud mountains like the sunrise and then came crashing down the hills toward us, sending a flurry of cherry blossoms fluttering in the air like butterflies. The dragon reminded me of a kaleidoscope as it morphed into every color of the rainbow before rising up on an air current at the last possible moment, narrowly avoiding crashing into the mushroom forest below. Its long, snaking body extended for miles and was soon lost above us in the clouds. A few moments later, the skyward cherry blossoms fell around us like snow, and continued in that way for a while afterwards, until the ground was pink with them. We kicked them up into the air with our feet as we walked, like fallen leaves in autumn. The gnomes didn't even interrupt their song, as if such things were an everyday occurrence. And I realized they probably were. "This place is incredible," I said. "No wonder you've been spending so much time out here." Uncle Ivan was smiling and nodding, seeing that I understood him even more now. But there was something off about him. He had lost weight. His face looked skeletal and thin. The change had been so slow I had barely noticed, since I came out to his workshop pretty much every day. But he previously had chubby cheeks and a belly which overhung his belt. Now those things were gone and he appeared gaunt and pale. "Come on, I'll show you my house," he said, laughing and taking my hand. "Your house." He led me up the slope towards the mushroom village. The stalks of the fungi had windows and doors carved into them with care, and the quaint community reminded me of the downtown of a small medieval village. There were rustic shops with tables out front, a blacksmith, and a market stall with fruits and vegetables. Gnomes were going about their lives in harmony and happiness. "In here," Uncle Ivan said, opening the squeaky door at the base of one mushroom. He ducked his head and went inside through the low entryway and I followed after him. Once inside, I saw a tastefully decorated room with furnishings in purple, orange, and gold. There was no indication we were inside a mushroom. It just looked like a regular house, only circular instead of square. He went over to a large cabinet and began to pull things from his pockets, shoving them inside the drawers. "Just a minute, let me get organized," Uncle Ivan said. He took a large horned beetle from one pocket of his bathrobe and stuffed it into a drawer, then started searching through the other drawers for something. I saw a purple octopus poke its head out of one and he crammed it back inside. Another drawer sounded like it contained a swarm of bees, while another made a sound like a train whistle. and the roar of a locomotive coming down the tracks. Uncle Ivan slammed that one shut quickly as the chugging, rattling noise of an approaching train became so loud it threatened to burst an eardrum. He breathed a sigh of relief, then opened a bottom drawer, retrieved a polka dot umbrella and unfurled it. A dozen or so frogs fell out from the folds and began hopping around on the floor, but he ignored them. Okay, all set. How about some breakfast? The two of us set out on the town and met gnomes on the way to a tea shop. They were singing Uncle Ivan's praises. Literally, they had written several songs about him. Most seemed to proclaim him as a savior and a hero, vanquishing an evil enemy which came in the night. What's with the creepy songs? I asked him as we took a seat at a table outside the tea shop. They keep talking about a monster coming in the night. That's not real, is it? I mean, I thought this place was all about peace and beauty. You can't have good without evil, my Uncle Ivan said, raising his hand to call over a gnome waiter. Yin and yang. You need one to have the other. This place couldn't be what it is without an evil underbelly. For heaven to exist, there must be hell, after all. Our waiter quickly poured our tea, then hustled away, his eyes fearful, and his hand shaking as he overheard our conversation. Another member of the waitstaff brought a platter of biscuits and cakes, then hurried off as well, looking similarly frightened by the subjects we were speaking about. Does it always come at night? The monster in the songs? Always. But it's okay. I know how to take care of it. I always protect the villagers here. They need me to protect them. I'm their savior. His eyes looked to be gazing far into the distance past me, and I was suddenly worried again for my Uncle Ivan. I took a sip of the tea, but it did not quench my thirst. I ate one of the cookies as well, but felt no less hungry afterwards. My uncle ignored all of the items in front of us, choosing instead to stare off in the distance, and once again I remarked to myself how thin he looked. How unwell. Despite the beauty of his creation, despite the absolutely remarkable nature of all of it, I was suddenly feeling scared. Not just for my uncle, but for me. I wanted to go home. I wanted to get out of this place. Opening my mouth to speak these thoughts aloud, it suddenly grew dark in the mushroom village and the surrounding fungi forest. A huge black cloud filled with booming thunder was rolling over us, and rain began to pour down, drenching us immediately. Gnomes ran into their houses and slammed the doors and windows closed. Open signs were pulled down from shop windows, and one saying, "Closed," replaced them, and yet still my Uncle Ivan stared off into the distance. "Uncle Ivan," I said, grabbing his shoulder and squeezing it. "Uncle Ivan, are you there?" My heart started pounding faster as his glazed eyes remained fixed on some invisible object in the distance. For a second I thought he would stay like that forever, but then he blinked and focused on me again. "Oh, sorry, I must have been lost in my thoughts." He looked around and saw the darkness and the rain and stood up quickly. "Dear, oh dear, we should go. Quickly, now, come on, let's get back to the house before it's too late." I thought at first he was talking about going back to the real world and nearly jumped for joy. I followed after him in the pounding rain and splashed through mud puddles as he led me back to his safe house inside the mushroom. It was only once we were inside that I heard the sounds coming from nearby, growing louder and more distinct. It sounded like the floor-shaking approach of a bear or a lion stalking towards us. My uncle grabbed a large wooden plank from behind the couch and brought it over to the door quickly, his eyes wide and fearful. "Help me with this, quickly. They'll be here any second." I hesitated, feeling as if something about this was wrong. But then my fear took over and I grabbed the other end of the wooden board and helped him lay it across the doorway, barricading it. A second later the door began to pound and shake as something tried to force its way in from outside. It sounded like claws raking across the wood as the thing roared and banged against the entry with all its might. "What the hell is that thing?" I asked my uncle. He was too busy to answer, searching through his large dresser with its countless tiny drawers. "Where is it? Where is it?" he shouted, pulling one open after another. "It must be here. It has to be." I ran over to him, looking back over my shoulder at the door as it nearly broke in two with the repeated impacts from outside. Now it sounded like not just one creature, but several, their claws tearing through the wood like paper. "Uncle Ivan, we have to get out of here. They're gonna kill us." As he pulled open one drawer after another, I saw horrors inside each that I will never forget. The dresser had been full of fun and whimsical items from what I'd seen before, but now every drawer he opened had a nightmare inside. A hooded figure reached out with a skeletal arm, a scythe gripped in his bony fist. My uncle slammed the drawer shut before it could emerge. The next had a freakish monster with bulging eyes and squid-like tentacles which snapped in the air and hissed with a big mouth full of many sharp teeth. He closed that drawer hastily as well. The door we had barred shut began to splinter and I could see forms through the growing cracks in the wood. It seemed as if one more impact would break it open and we would be murdered by whatever came inside to greet us. All darkness, fangs, and claws by the looks of it. My uncle finally found what he was looking for and pulled it out from the dresser drawer, shouting in triumph, "Yes, I found it. Let's get the hell out of here." It was a paintbrush and an easel. He began to paint a picture on the wall beside him, working so quickly it didn't seem possible. A few moments after he had begun, there was a beautiful doorway with a blue sky and sunshine. There were trees and green grassy fields rolling into the distance. "Come on, through here," he said, grabbing my arm. I didn't move, though. Something about all of this was wrong. I thought to myself again, Uncle Ivan needed my help, and this wasn't the way to help him. Escaping further into his fantasy world, going one step deeper into this dimension, or whatever this was not going to help him. I studied his bony face and looked at his thin, frail hand reaching out to take mine. "Come on, what are you waiting for?" he asked, looking terrified, checking over my shoulder for the next impact from outside. "That isn't the way, Uncle Ivan," I said, realizing what I meant when I said it. "That's not the way home, and I need to take you home. You need to eat and drink, and you need to get out of this place for a little while. You can't survive here. You can't live inside this world you created or it'll kill you." "What? No, I can't leave. This is my home now. I need to protect it." The door splintered further with another loud bang as the dark forms forced their weight against the threshold. "Do you know what's on the other side of that door, Uncle Ivan? Have you ever waited to see what will come through? Or do you just escape further into your fantasies and run away every time?" He hesitated, looking as if he might jump through the doorway without me, escaping into that other world never to be seen again. But then he turned to look at me and let out a deep, shuddering breath. "No, I've always run away from it. I suppose I should look at it, though, shouldn't I? We all need to face our fears sometime, Uncle Ivan," I said, taking his hand. "We'll face it together, whatever it is." He gripped my hand tightly and we stood waiting for our demise or for whatever would come next. With a loud crash, the door broke open and dark forms in the shape of every alpha predator began to squeeze through, looking like oversized, nightmare images of their true selves, shadowy bodies with no discernible features except for their teeth. Their teeth, which were too long and too sharp, gleaming white. As they closed in on us, I focused on that lack of color and remembered those blank spots in the mural. I thought about home. I braced for the impact and for the teeth which would tear me to shreds. But they never came. When I opened my eyes and looked up, I saw a wall in front of me with a wolf painted in black and white. It hadn't been filled in yet. A ray of sunshine was peeking in through the doorway which led outside, and I could hear birds chirping out there. We were back in my great-uncle's studio again, and he was beside me, holding my hand, squeezing it very tightly. Both of us let go at the same time, looking at each other and feeling slightly embarrassed for some reason, as if what had just happened hadn't really happened. "Looks like you missed a spot, after all," I said to my uncle. He looked back at me and I saw tears in his eyes. He wanted to say something back, but couldn't. Instead, he picked up his paintbrush, which was sitting nearby with an easel. Various colors were there on the board, waiting to be chosen to fill in the empty spots, to make the mural really, truly complete. My uncle went over to the spot with his paintbrush in hand, looking ready to fill in the emptiness. As he picked up the brush, his hand started to shake. Maybe from hunger, maybe from something else. I laid a hand on his shoulder, stopping him. "Why don't you take a break for a little while, Uncle Ivan? Let's go inside and grab a bite to eat. The mural will still be here tomorrow." He turned to look at me and smiled, then set the paintbrush and easel down on the floor again. Putting his arm around my shoulder, the two of us walked out from the paint fumes and into the fresh air of the backyard. "You know," I said, "I was kinda bummed out when I thought the mural was finished. This project has been such a big part of both of our lives these last few years. Maybe you should just leave that one spot blank, like a signature, a reminder of all the time and effort you put in. Here, in the real world." He nodded, his eyes focused and lucid for the first time since I'd seen him that day. Uncle Ivan pointed at a large mountain off in the distance. It took me a second to understand, but I'd always been able to see what he meant in these muted moments, and I did then too. Yeah, like a landmark, so no matter what, you can always find your way home. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, then hit the like. See you guys next time.